In this podcast, we're going to look at something, or some things, which can be overlooked by students of military history, but they're all very important for any army to have had success. And it's especially important for you because there's a lot that an examiner could ask you about it. The organisation and logistics of an army concerns how the army is, obviously, organised, and how it is supplied, which is the logistics bit. Supply, logistics, how to get people, how to get supplies into places is logistics. Life in the army, for the soldiers themselves and the discipline that they experienced, are also key things that have changed over the ages. An army doesn't simply turn up and the fighting happens. Armies were often on the road for weeks or months at a time before they started fighting. Just imagine somebody giving you the task of organising food for feeding 10,000 men for months. It's a lot of food. Then if you add to the mix that the 10,000 men that you have to feed will be moving about 15 to 30 miles a day, and might even leave the country, then you have a serious task. Whoever organised the armies of the past made it possible for those armies to win, and I can't think of one of them that has gone down in history. Not one of these men has ever gone down in history that I know of. And it's kind of significant because I did a degree in military history. So I'm going to dedicate this podcast to the unsung logistic heroes of military history, whatever they were called. First, when we think about the Roman army, as ever, they were way ahead of their time in logistics, discipline, and army life. With regards to organisation, the army was divided into legions of about 6,000 men. Each legion had several centurions to command the men. The Roman army had 28 legions, which means 150,000 regular soldiers. And they also had 150 auxiliary troops. Auxiliary troops, remember, being people who weren't Romans but fought for the Romans. Which means they had 300,000 men spread out across their vast empire that all had to be supplied. Can you imagine being given that job? Where would you even start? Well, they did it. Partly the logistics of supply was so successful because of the clever organisation of the army. Each legion of 6,000 had in it its own medical staff, carpenters for building things, vets, armourers, surveyors, priests, and 120 scouts on horseback to find things like water sources or the enemy. Roman soldiers would carry their own tents, and they would be supplied with generous rations of 3 pounds of bread, 2 pounds of meat, and 2 pints of wine per day for 300,000 men. They would also have fresh water supplies in their forts, if they happened to be in forts, and ways of safely removing the waste from the forts. All of this resulted in the astonishing fact that a Roman army soldier would live on average 5 years longer than Roman citizens who weren't soldiers. This is incredible, because they were doing a job in which people were trying to kill them. As for discipline, it was quite simply harsh. If you broke a regulation, you'd be killed. They also had a punishment called decimation, which was saved up for the worst offences like deserting the army. The Roman army actually managed to think up of a punishment that was worse than just simple death. What would happen would be that the unit in which the offending soldier came from would have to divide themselves into groups of 10. They would all then draw lots, and the soldier who lost would be beaten to death by the other 9, either with clubs or by stoning. So if you did a serious offence whilst a Roman soldier, you really weren't just letting yourself down, you were letting your mates down too. Of course, the person who actually did the offence, they didn't have to draw lots, they would be beaten or stoned to death anyway. So the Romans, excellent at logistics, huge army spread over a huge empire, very disciplined, and the soldiers were all well cared for, so life was pretty good as a Roman soldier for the standards of the time. I bet by now you can guess that it took a very long time, centuries and centuries, before we returned to anything like this. If you did guess that, then good guess. It's worth pointing out that the Celts they fought against didn't usually have problems with logistics, because if they wanted to fight, then they just grabbed a weapon and went to fight. It was never really far away from home, and they didn't fight for long before going back to their home. There was no Celtic army to speak of, though sometimes, as with Boudicca, they banded together and went off to fight. When the fighting was done, they simply went back to farming. There was no Celtic standing army. When we fast forward to the early medieval period around 1066 with the Saxon army, we see that things haven't changed all that much from the Celts. It's changed a lot from the Romans. The Saxons had a few professional soldiers who acted as bodyguards most of the time, called the huscarls, but mostly it was a case of calling out the peasants to fight if there was a fight to be had, and this was called calling out the feared. If the feared was called out, they'd partly live off the land and partly use the king's supply wagons, if there were some available. Just like the Celts, there was no standing Saxon army, so there was no set discipline, but rest assured anybody who ran off in battle would have been punished if caught. But there was no set punishments, nothing written down in rules, and we've no record of any punishments handed out, so there's not much to say on Saxon army discipline. Just bear in mind there would have been some. The Norman army that fought at the same time were much the same as the Saxon army. They lived off the land, or the king's supply wagons were available. To give you an example, before the Battle of Hastings, William of Normandy's troops burned and pillaged around Pevensey Bay, which is where they had landed in England. Most historians agree that this was to draw Harold Godwinson down to fight him quickly, so they didn't have to deal with the tricky problem of supplying his army in a foreign country for a long period, which would have been extremely difficult, if not impossible. And of course, he would also be sending his troops to pillage supplies from around the local area. There was again no standing army, so no set form of punishments were handed out. But don't make the mistake, same as before, of thinking that people could do what they like when fighting for the Saxons or the Normans. Punishments would have happened, we just don't know what they were, and they weren't necessarily, if you do this, this happens. It might just be up to whoever was in charge. Life in the Celtic and Saxon and Norman armies would have been very short and very hard, because the vast majority of the army just turned up to fight, and then went back home again. From 1350 to 1450, i.e. from the mid to late medieval period, you might be aware from your lessons and previous podcasts that armies remained pretty small. The main reason for this was because they were so expensive to pay for, and one of the main reasons they were so expensive to pay for was because of the logistics. For example, when Edward III invaded France, he only took 4,000 soldiers with him. And along with that, he had to send 1,300 sides of bacon, 200 tons of grain, 50 tons of cheese, and 30 tons of peas and beans. That means he must have had to pay a lot of people to ship the stuff over to France and transport it alongside the army. And you can see that this would cost a lot of money. Furthermore, it is known that he kept 11,000 spare bows and 24,000 spare arrows in the Tower of London, so that he could equip his armies. This difficulty with regards to logistics and the expense involved also links to why warfare remained limited warfare in this period, as opposed to total warfare. The armies would meet, fight, or have a siege, then negotiate and go home, because it was simply too expensive to fight for long periods. There was also an issue with feudal duty, because, as you know, many people in medieval armies were fighting because they owed feudal duty, in return for the land they worked on. But feudal duty only lasted for 45 days a year, which is about a month and a half, so large portions of armies would go home after that. You'll also know that some people paid scutage instead of fighting, and that kings used this money to pay for mercenaries. Mercenaries were very expensive, and so armies remained small. And to make sure they could afford plenty of mercenaries, the king would increase taxes on the English people. So the burden got higher, but of course the money from scutage only lasted a certain amount of time, again linking to this limited warfare. So when the money ran out, the mercenaries couldn't be paid any longer, so they went. As for discipline, it's the same as the early medieval period. People were definitely punished harshly for anything they did wrong whilst in the army, but there was no standing army, so there were no standard punishments. Life in the army was also like the Celtic, Saxon and Norman armies, because it was short. Most of the army turned up to fight and then went home again soon afterwards, so life was short and quite harsh. During the medieval periods then, armies remained small, largely because of the difficulties with the logistics of supplying the army, and wars had limited aims, so people didn't stay in the army for very long. They fought, did their duty, and then went home. Things changed in the 17th century as Britain got its first standing army, the New Model Army, and there was a huge and terrible civil war that ravaged the country. There was also widespread use of gunpowder weaponry, and therefore calling up untrained peasants for feudal service, bringing their own weapons, became less and less useful. People needed training to use these new weapons. Things changed a lot with discipline, logistics, organisation and army life in the 17th century. Logistics issue was still a difficult one. 250 wagons were needed just to carry the flour, and armies don't only need flour, for making bread for 30,000 troops. So most troops still had to feed themselves by living off the land or stealing, which, if an army does it, is called pillaging. You might remember that the Roman army slept in the tents they were provided with and carried around with them. Not so for the soldiers of the Civil War, even for the New Model Army. The New Model Army weren't provided with tents until 1650, which is just 1 year before the war ended. Most soldiers had to sleep in the open, or find some shelter to take over, with or without the owner's permission. Life was also not so great in terms of medicine, because people still didn't know much about germs or how the body works. So more often than not, if you were wounded, then you died from your wounds, even if it wasn't immediately. And this was often because things became infected, but you can see more about that on the Medicine podcast. Logistics were a bit better for the New Model Army, though. They still at times did have to resort to pillaging or living off the land, but things did improve because they were organised from London, so their organisation was centralised. They issued the New Model Army with uniforms, organised in London. They also made sure as much as possible that the army was supplied. In one campaign in Scotland, to give an example, the army were given standardised 7-day rations. Standardised means it was decided by the quartermaster, who was the person in charge of supplies, how much the men would need over a 7-day period, and each man got that same standardised amount. In the 18th century, wars abroad became a bit more commonplace, but there would still be limited wars because warfare was so expensive. Also, the logistics were a nightmare, as the armies had to be supplied, often abroad, by large quantities of food, weaponry and ammunition, and all of this had to follow the armies on huge, long, winding baggage trains. This also made it very difficult to fight in the winter months, because the roads were so primitive, and therefore most wars occurred from April to October, when the roads were still not ridiculously muddy and difficult to pass. And in the winter months there was no grass, of course, for the horses to graze, and they needed horses to pull the baggage trains, and also to fight in the cavalry. It was also the bizarre case that the roads, and especially maps at the time, were so poor that armies who wanted to fight each other often couldn't actually find one another. Communication was also terribly slow. As the period wore on, the armies grew, especially with the French Revolutionary Wars from 1793 to 1815, when the British Army grew to 250,000 men. This meant that living off the land was no longer possible, because the armies simply wouldn't find enough on the land, and so the armies had to be supplied by baggage train. Soldiers were typically given 1 pound of bread and 1 pound of beef per day, sometimes with cheese. It's worth comparing that to the 3 pounds of bread and 2 pounds of meat that the Romans used to get about 1,400 years earlier. When food ran out, armies did still take things from the land, or pillage things from towns or villages, but it was never enough. So armies had to stop every 4 days and set up army kitchens to supply to supply the troops again. It meant armies made very slow progress. Armies also needed huge quantities of horses. For example, in the 1800s, an army of 50,000 would need 40,000 horses for the cavalry and for pulling wagons. And each horse would need 20 pounds of hay and 9 pounds of oats each. So you had to have horses and wagons to carry the supplies for the men, and horses and wagons to carry supplies for the horses. You can hopefully see why armies were so slow and so expensive, and why, with the French Revolutionary Wars aside, the wars of the 18th century tended to be limited wars. Because of all these logistical problems, the organisation of the British Army, which was by the 18th century a permanent standing army, had to improve, and the organisation did improve. When armies were small, they were billeted, which basically means they seized houses to sleep in wherever they happened to be. But 18th century armies quickly became far too big for this, so the first barracks were built. The first barracks were very basic, with 2 men to 1 bed and no kitchens, so all food was prepared in the same room that the men slept. But there were for the first time barracks in the 18th century for the British Army, which was a step forward. There was also a brand new place in London from which the army could be organised. Now, you might remember in the Civil War in the 1600s, i.e. 17th century, the new model army was organised from London. Well, by the 18th century, there was an office created in which people organised things to do with war. So they called it the War Office. And it was situated on Horse Guards Parade in London. It's still there today. It was created in 1722. The army was also separated into regiments that had their own bases dotted around the country, so each regiment had their own base to help organise things like accommodation, supplies and finance for all of this. The War Office made sure all weapons, uniform and equipment was standardised so that the whole army fought as one. Much better organisation. As for discipline, this had to be kept extremely harsh because most of the recruits were from the lower rungs of society. As the historian Michael Howard said, "It became more difficult to recruit into the ranks of the armies anyone except social dropouts, criminals, dupes and half-wits, who could only be kept under control by ferocious discipline." That's my historian voice, by the way. There was, however, by this point, more of a ranking of punishments rather than just death, as with the Roman and then the New Model Army. And the New Model Army had just used death for most things that had been done wrong. For example, a minor offence in the 18th century might mean a demotion or being given extra patrol duties. A worse offence might mean whipping, which would cause terrible injuries. They could also lengthen the term of service of a soldier before he would be allowed to leave the army, which is terrible, but the worst offences still led to a death sentence. In the 19th century, things changed again, and this was largely as a result of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution meant that things got invented, factories were able to produce more stuff cheaper and quicker, and we got richer, all of which meant we could have bigger and more efficient armies. Armies got even bigger and fought further away from Britain. We had an empire that at one point stretched over a third of all the land on Earth, so logistics and organisation had to improve once again. The main war in the 19th century, after the French Revolutionary Wars, was the Crimean War, fought in Russia, 4,000 miles away from London. But steamships improved transport and supplies to the Crimea. Transport and supplies is logistics, by the way, if you haven't got that yet. There were always railways to help with things too, and railways made transporting troops about 15 times faster than before. Armies by the Crimean War could now build railways specifically for a particular war, as happened in the Crimea, when a 25-mile track was built from the coast to the British trenches at Sevastopol. There was also the invention of the telegraph, which made communications a great deal quicker. By the First World War, discipline was still a mixture of corporal punishment, which means stuff that hurts, non-corporal punishment, like being given toilet cleaning duty, and death, for things like desertion. Logistics had improved massively since the Crimea, so that thousands of shells, ammunition, weapons and more were sent to the front each week to serve the British Army, which by the end of the war had 4 million men in it, so it's a good job we were organised and good at logistics. The country, by the time of the end of the war, was extremely well organised, but it took a little while to get going. You might know all of this from your Impact of War module, which crosses over with this module when it comes to the World Wars. In the First World War we ended up well organised, but took a while to get going, whereas we were very organised straight away in the Second World War, having learnt lessons from the First World War. For example, compulsory rationing, which means you had to do it, was not introduced until 1918, and we ended up with only 6 weeks' worth of wheat left at one point in 1917 because of the German submarines. But by the Second World War we knew about the risks of German submarines, so rationing was introduced near the beginning of the war in January 1940. Between the wars, the government had built shadow factories next to car factories. These weren't factories that made shadows, they were empty shells of factories that could easily be converted to make war products like aeroplanes or tanks if a war broke out. And of course a war did break out in September 1939. By the Second World War, discipline had changed a bit too, because we no longer gave out the death penalty for desertion and other things like that. The death penalty was only reserved for really extreme things like murder. There's a double page spread on 20th century logistics in the textbook, so it must be considered quite important by the exam board. We'll go into detail a little bit here as a result, using that page as a guide, and it kind of crosses over with some of the things we've said. We no longer have to cart supplies around behind armies on long baggage trains. We've got jet planes, helicopters, and lorries, so that supplies can be kept in a central place and quickly moved to the soldiers that need it. In 1888, the Army Service Corps was founded, specifically for ensuring the efficient supply of the Army. By 1918, there were over 300,000 men in the Army Service Corps, and they supplied the Western Front with an outrageous 30,000 tonnes of meat and 40,000 tonnes of bread every month. In 1993, the Army Service Corps had a bit of a name change to the Royal Logistics Corps, and there are currently 16,000 people in the Royal Logistics Corps, and they provide all the food that the Army needs, be it in food kitchens near the front lines or through ration packs. In 2009, the British troops in Afghanistan were given 4,000 calorie ration packs of food, which included things like corned beef, fruit dumplings in custard, whatever fruit dumplings are, chocolate, and even chicken tikka masala. We've got very good at it now. We can get food to the soldiers, and we can provide food to the soldiers that's easy for them to carry about and prepare. When it comes to transporting the troops, nowadays most of this is done by air. In fact, 90% of troop transport happens by air. But 90% of supplies still come by ship, which is a bit cheaper. The Army often sources this out, so they don't keep the many planes and ships that would be needed to serve the Army in far-flung places like Iraq or Afghanistan at all times, just in case a war breaks out, because that would be really expensive, and where would they keep them all? Instead, they buy much of the transport in when it's needed. We've got a standing army, and it's got its own transport, but we just buy in extras by using private contractors. For example, when 45,000 troops, their tents, food, water, fuel and portaloos were needed in Iraq in 2003, 49% of the air transport and 88% of the sea transport was done by private contractors, which just means private companies. Suppose it's a little bit like having a small standing logistics corps and buying in logistic mercenaries when war breaks out. Anyway, if we're making comparisons, then during the Boer War in 1901, it took about 1 month to transport troops and supplies the 6,000 miles from Britain to South Africa and the surrounding areas, which is where the war was fought. But in 2003, in the Iraq War, it would take 7 hours to fly supplies 3,000 miles. So we've come a long way in logistics terms in 102 years. So that's logistics, with a bit of organisation, discipline and army life mixed in. As with most things we've looked at, things during the Roman period were pretty amazing considering it was 2,000 years ago, and it took us a long time to catch up. But since the Industrial Revolution, we've taken some colossal strides so that now we can easily supply our army, wherever they are in the world, with tons and tons of material in less than 24 hours. We focus a lot on the fighting and weapons in the module, but if it wasn't for the logistics people, then none of this would have been possible. Seriously. In the 17th and early 18th century, it was possible to win a war by capturing or destroying the enemy's baggage train, as they did not have enough food or supplies to carry on the fight. Anyway, logistics people, I salute you. You are unsung heroes. And here are some logistics-based questions that you could be asked in your exams.